It all begins in a quiet way, without much excitement or noise, almost the sort of beginning you would expect if someone was leaning back in a chair, trying to explain to you how the past slowly unfolded, detail by detail. Imagine, if you will, the earliest days of the North American continent before it ever became the United States. The story is not the kind you see in quick documentaries, where voices are rushed and the images flick past the screen. Instead, this story moves at the rhythm of passing years, of winds across forests, and of rivers carving their way through stone. Because history itself, when lived, was never in a hurry. Long before ships crossed the Atlantic, the land that would become the United States was already filled with people, countless generations who lived and died without ever hearing the word America. Their villages were scattered across the forests of the Northeast, the Great Plains stretching endlessly, and the deserts and mountains of the West. They planted corn, hunted bison, built homes, raised children, and buried their dead in ways that made perfect sense to them. The ground beneath their feet was not empty land, as some later liked to describe it. It was already a web of stories, of traditions passed along around fires, of quiet agreements between people and the land they depended upon. For thousands of years, the rhythms of life moved slowly. Crops rose and fell with the seasons, hunting grounds were remembered and revisited, and rivers served as roads long before anyone thought of laying down tracks or building highways. The land was not silent. It carried the steady voices of people who belonged to it. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, had already organized themselves into a powerful political structure long before Europeans arrived, showing that ideas of governance, diplomacy, and balance were not inventions of the so-called modern age, but had existed for centuries. In the Southwest, the ancestors of the Pueblo peoples carved homes into cliffs, creating settlements that could endure both the heat of day and the chill of night. Across the Mississippi Valley, enormous earthen mounds rose, built by hands whose names are no longer remembered, yet whose labor shaped landscapes that can still be traced today. When the Europeans finally came, their sails rising on the horizon, they did not arrive into emptiness, nor did they bring civilization into a void. They stumbled instead into lives already long in motion. The first contacts were often brief, sometimes cautious, sometimes violent. Fishermen off the coast of Newfoundland found seas so heavy with cod that they could scoop the fish up in baskets. Traders brought trinkets, iron tools, beads, and weapons, which quickly became absorbed into the fabric of native life, altering balances of power in ways that would take generations to fully reveal themselves. But this is not yet the United States, not yet the 13 colonies, not yet revolution or founding fathers. Those things come later. What we see in these early moments is the quiet layering of encounters, the slow accumulation of misunderstandings, the ways in which two worlds, native and European, began to overlap. Neither side truly understood the other. For the Europeans, the land seemed vast and almost limitless, as if it could absorb their dreams, their failures, their ambitions. For the natives, the newcomers seemed at first like peculiar figures, strangers who carried thunder in their hands, who measured wealth not in corn or land shared among kin, but in glittering metal and paper promises. The first settlements were fragile, often close to failure. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was nearly destroyed by hunger and disease. Pilgrims who landed on the cold shores of New England found themselves unprepared for the harshness of winter. Without native help, many of those first English colonists would have vanished into the earth as quietly as they had come. The story we are telling does not rush past this fact. It lingers on it. Imagine the settlers, huddled in crude shelters, their bodies weakened, their spirits strained, wondering if perhaps the sea itself had betrayed them by bringing them here. Imagine, too, the native people, watching these strangers, calculating whether to help them, to ignore them, or to drive them away. The early history of what would become the United States was not inevitable triumph, but a fragile balance of survival. Time stretched on, and the colonies grew, not in a sudden explosion, but in the quiet, slow accumulation of families, farms, and towns. Children were born who had never seen England or France, who only knew the forests and fields of America. They grew up with new accents, new customs, forming a culture that was already different from that of the lands their parents had left behind. It was in these subtle shifts, the blending of old traditions with new realities, that something distinct began to form, something that would eventually become the American identity, though no one at the time would have thought to name it that way. And yet, alongside this growth, shadows deepened. The arrival of Europeans also meant the arrival of diseases, carried invisibly across oceans. Illnesses like smallpox spread with devastating speed through native communities, erasing entire villages before settlers had even seen them. To the colonists, the land seemed to open up. But this illusion was built upon tragedy, an emptiness carved by loss. And as time went on, another shadow took root: the transatlantic slave trade. Ships that carried goods one way carried human beings the other, forcing men, women, and children from Africa into a life of labor in the New World. By the mid-1600s, slavery was already binding itself into the economic and social structures of the colonies, especially in the South, where tobacco and rice plantations demanded relentless labor. All of this, native lives disrupted, settlers struggling to survive, enslaved people torn from their homelands, was the foundation of the place that would one day call itself the United States. It was not built quickly, nor was it built cleanly. It was slow, messy, filled with contradiction. When people speak of beginnings, they often like to make them neat, to say that America began in 1776, with fireworks and declarations. But the truth is more gradual, more ordinary, and in some ways, more haunting. America's beginnings stretched across centuries, whispered in the quiet stories of those who endured hunger, in the cries of those who were enslaved, in the resilience of those who resisted. So, when we talk about the birth of the United States, we must imagine not a single moment, but a long, drawn-out process, a slow layering of events, choices, and accidents. Imagine, if you will, the forests being cleared, the rivers being named and renamed, the fields being planted over and over until the soil itself carried memory. Imagine how slowly the idea of a new world turned into the idea of our world, how what once seemed temporary, the small towns, the crude settlements became permanent. As children grew into adults and adults into elders who could look back and say, "We have always been here," even though just a generation before, that had not been true. This is where the story truly begins, not with heroes or great battles, but with the slow passage of time, with ordinary people making choices that seemed small to them, but immense to us. It is a story of survival, of adjustment, of patience, and in its quietness, in its ordinariness, lies the real beginning of what would become the United States. By the time the 17th century was well underway, the fragile colonies scattered along the eastern seaboard were beginning to look less like desperate encampments and more like societies that intended to remain. Wooden houses rose sturdier, fields stretched wider, and docks filled with ships carrying goods back and forth across the Atlantic. But what must be remembered is that all of this unfolded slowly, year after year, in a rhythm that would have felt ordinary to those who lived it. To them, there was no grand announcement that a nation is being born. There was only the hard labor of plowing fields, repairing fences, waiting for harvests, raising children, and worrying over storms or illness. Yet, from this ordinariness, the United States would gradually emerge. The 13 colonies that would one day join together under one banner began as very different experiments. Massachusetts Bay Colony was heavily shaped by Puritans who carried with them a vision of strict religious order, where every detail of life was to reflect their faith. In Virginia, by contrast, the colony revolved around tobacco, its cultivation, its trade, and the fortunes it could bring. The Chesapeake was not built on dreams of religious purity, but on the hope that fields of green leaves might be turned into gold through the markets of Europe. To the south, colonies like South Carolina and Georgia leaned even more heavily on enslaved labor, drawing on the brutal system that shipped men, women, and children from Africa against their will to toil in rice fields and indigo plantations. And so, from the very beginning, the colonies were divided by both purpose and identity. There was no single American way of life. Not yet. Instead, there were threads. Religion in the north, commerce in the middle colonies, plantation slavery in the south. Each colony had its own rhythms, its own laws, its own outlook. If you traveled from Boston to Charleston in the early 1700s, you might feel as though you were passing through entirely different worlds. And yet, slowly, connections began to form. Trade routes knitted the colonies together, carrying goods along the coast and across the Atlantic. Ships from New England brought fish, timber, and rum to the Caribbean, returning with sugar and molasses. Enslaved Africans were carried through the infamous Middle Passage, packed tightly into ships, treated as cargo rather than as human beings. This system, sometimes called the triangular trade, was not drawn neatly on maps, but it was lived in every port, every marketplace, every plantation. The wealth of the colonies, and indeed much of the world at the time, rested on this movement of goods and people, of forced labor and profit. But alongside this harsh reality, there were also quieter developments. Families in New England gathered each Sunday in meeting houses, their lives ordered by sermons and scripture. Farmers in Pennsylvania, many of them Quakers, spoke of peace and tolerance, even as they cleared land that had once belonged to native peoples. German immigrants brought with them their farming techniques. Dutch merchants filled warehouses with imported wares. Scots-Irish settlers pushed into the backcountry, carving out cabins along the edge of the frontier. Each group carried traditions, dialects, recipes, and stories that blended slowly into the diverse mosaic that would become colonial America. This was also a time when ideas were spreading, ideas that traveled as easily as ships. The Enlightenment in Europe, its talk of reason, science, and natural rights, did not remain across the ocean. Books and pamphlets crossed the Atlantic, filling the minds of colonial thinkers with questions about authority, governance, and freedom. At the same time, the Great Awakening, a wave of religious revival in the mid-1700s, swept through towns and villages, filling fields with crowds who listened to fiery sermons about sin and salvation. These two currents, the rational and the spiritual, seemed different, but together they stirred something new. A questioning of established order, a restlessness that hinted at change. Daily life, however, remained marked by simplicity and struggle. Imagine a family in rural Massachusetts. The father rises before dawn, tending to livestock, mending tools, preparing for a day that promises little rest. The mother oversees the household, spinning thread, preparing meals, instructing children in reading and scripture. The children, from the time they are small, are expected to work, fetching water, gathering firewood, learning the trades that will sustain them. Life was not lived in leisure, but in labor. And yet, it was within this labor that the colonies slowly grew strong. Each fence built, each harvest stored, each child taught to read and write, pushed the society one step further from fragility and closer to permanence. Conflict, of course, was never absent. Relations with native peoples grew tense as settlers expanded. Treaties were signed and broken, promises made and forgotten. Violence erupted, sometimes in small raids, sometimes in large wars. King Philip's War in the late 1600s devastated New England, leaving scars that endured for generations. In the South, Enslaved Africans resisted in whatever ways they could, from subtle acts of defiance to uprisings like the Stono Rebellion. The colonies were not peaceful places of unity, but contested grounds, where power was always shifting, where lives were often caught between competing forces. Yet, for all the divisions and conflicts, a slow sense of shared identity was forming. Colonists began to see themselves not merely as Englishmen abroad, but as something different, shaped by the land they lived on and the distance from the crown that claimed authority over them. Letters, newspapers, and sermons carried common themes: complaints about taxes, reflections on liberty, concerns about the future. Though still loyal to Britain, many colonists were beginning to ask, how long could a people remain children of a distant parent? How long before they claimed adulthood for themselves? The early 1700s stretched on in this way, quietly but steadily pushing toward transformation. A visitor walking through Philadelphia might hear half a dozen languages spoken in the streets. A traveler in Virginia might see vast plantations worked by hundreds of enslaved laborers. In Boston, meetings in taverns and town halls buzzed with debate about local governance, about trade, about rights. None of this felt like revolution at the time. It felt like ordinary life. But beneath the surface, the pieces of a larger story were falling into place. When wars broke out between European empires, wars like Queen Anne's War or King George's War, the colonies were drawn in, fighting on behalf of crowns thousands of miles away. Soldiers marched through forests, forts were built and abandoned, alliances with native tribes were made and unmade. To the colonists, these wars brought both danger and opportunity. They exposed how vulnerable the colonies were when relying on Britain for protection, and at the same time, they gave colonists experience in organizing, fighting, and defending their own interests. These conflicts were practice, in a way, for struggles that were still to come. And so, by the middle of the 18th century, the colonies had grown from fragile outposts into a collection of societies that were complex, diverse, and restless. They were not yet united, but they were no longer fragile seedlings. They had roots deep enough to withstand storms and branches that were beginning to stretch in directions no one could yet predict. The story of America was still ordinary, still filled with the daily labors of farmers, merchants, enslaved workers, and settlers, but it was also becoming something larger. Something that hinted at the possibility of breaking away from the old world to claim a new destiny. If you pause here and imagine the colonies from above, you would see towns nestled against harbors, smoke rising from chimneys, ships gliding in and out of ports, farms patchworked across landscapes, roads muddy and uneven, but carrying carts nonetheless. You would see the contrasts: wealth and poverty, freedom and bondage, order and rebellion. And you would sense that slowly something was gathering, like a storm too distant to hear, but close enough to feel in the shifting air. The colonies did not yet know that they would soon be tested in ways that would change everything. For now, they lived in their ordinary rhythms, convinced that tomorrow would look much like today. But history was already moving, quietly, beneath their feet. By the middle of the 18th century, the American colonies had reached a point where the ordinary routines of farming, trading, and building communities were accompanied by a deeper undercurrent of tension. To most colonists, life still seemed steady enough. Families worried about harvests, merchants about prices, and preachers about the state of their congregations. But far beyond their fields and town squares, global forces were moving, and those forces would soon push the colonies into a struggle that would change everything. The spark came not from within the colonies themselves, but from the long rivalry between European powers. Britain and France, old enemies on the continent, carried their competition into North America. Both nations claimed vast territories that often overlapped on maps drawn with more imagination than accuracy. The French stretched their influence along the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, and down the Mississippi Valley, creating a crescent of power that threatened to box in the English colonies. The British, meanwhile, were pushing westward, their settlers eager for land beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Native tribes, who had lived in these contested regions for centuries, were caught in the middle, forced to choose sides in a conflict that was not of their making, but that would shape their futures. This rivalry exploded into what became known in America as the French and Indian War, a name that reflected how colonists saw the struggle, though in truth, it was part of a much larger conflict known globally as the 7 Years' War. For the colonists, it was their first taste of a war that stretched far beyond their own borders. It was a war fought in forests and fields, in forts and villages, marked by shifting alliances and sudden violence. The fighting began in the Ohio River Valley, where British colonists and traders sought to establish a foothold. It was here, in 1754, that a young George Washington, still unknown, still learning, led a small force into the wilderness. He built a crude stockade called Fort Necessity, only to find himself surrounded by French forces and their native allies. Outnumbered and inexperienced, Washington surrendered, his signature placed on a document written in French that he barely understood. Though humiliating, this incident lit the fuse of a wider conflict. As war spread, Britain poured resources into the colonies, sending soldiers, weapons, and ships. Colonists enlisted, some eagerly, others reluctantly. They marched through unfamiliar landscapes, fought in ambushes and skirmishes, and endured the brutal realities of frontier warfare. Natives fought on both sides, often choosing alliances based on which European power might better protect their lands. Though in truth, both powers ultimately sought control rather than partnership. The war dragged on for years, testing the endurance of everyone involved. Forts changed hands, towns were burned, and fields were abandoned. To the colonists, the war was both frightening and strangely empowering. They saw British troops fight alongside them, but they also saw the limits of British power. They realized that survival often depended on their own militias, their own organization, their own resilience. A seed was planted. Perhaps they were capable of standing on their own, even if they did not yet say it aloud. By 1763, the war finally ended with the Treaty of Paris. Britain emerged victorious, gaining control of vast French territories in North America. On maps, it looked like triumph. The British flag now flew over lands stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. But victories carry consequences, and this one was no different. For one thing, the war had been staggeringly expensive. Britain, drowning in debt, looked across the ocean at its colonies and saw not only subjects, but taxpayers who might help shoulder the burden. For another, the native peoples who had once balanced French and British power now found themselves at the mercy of a single empire. Their bargaining position diminished, their lands more vulnerable than ever. The end of the war did not bring peace. Almost immediately, tensions flared on the frontier. Native resistance, led by figures like Pontiac of the Ottawa, erupted in attacks on British forts and settlements. Colonists, eager to claim new lands, clashed with natives who refused to surrender territories that had been theirs for generations. In response, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlers from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. To London, it was a sensible measure to maintain order and avoid endless frontier wars. To the colonists, it felt like a betrayal. After years of fighting and dying in the war, they were told that the land they had bled for was now off-limits. This was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Britain introduced a series of policies designed to extract revenue from the colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and other measures demanded taxes on goods, documents, and everyday items. To the British, these were minor contributions, a fair share of the empire's expenses. To the colonists, they were something more, a violation of the principle that taxes should only be levied by representatives chosen by the people themselves. Out of this frustration arose a phrase that would echo across taverns and meeting houses: "No taxation without representation." At first, the resistance was cautious. Petitions were written, protests held. Colonists insisted they were loyal subjects, asking only for fairness. But as each year passed, the resentment deepened. Newspapers filled with fiery essays, pamphlets spread arguments, and ordinary people debated politics in marketplaces and churches. The colonies were discovering not only their grievances, but also their voice. In towns like Boston, opposition grew louder. The formation of groups like the Sons of Liberty signaled a shift from polite protest to active resistance. Effigies of tax collectors were hanged, goods were boycotted, and British officials found themselves unwelcome in communities they had once governed with ease. The protests were not yet revolution, but they were a rehearsal for it. At the same time, everyday life continued. Farmers still planted crops, merchants still traded, families still gathered around fires at night. But beneath this normalcy, something was stirring. The war had shown colonists that they could fight, that they could organize, that they could imagine themselves as more than subjects of a distant king. British policies, meant to tighten control, instead loosened the bonds of loyalty. Each act of resistance, each conversation about rights, each refusal to submit quietly, added weight to the growing realization that the colonies were becoming something new. The story of the United States was not yet at its climax, but it was moving faster now. The slow centuries of settlement had given way to decades of argument, confrontation, and rising unrest. A storm was gathering, and though no one could yet see its full shape, its first winds were already felt. The French and Indian War had ended, but in its aftermath lay the seeds of a much greater conflict, one that would no longer be fought in the name of kings, but in the name of a people seeking to define themselves. And so, as the 1760s unfolded, the colonies stood at a crossroads. They were no longer fragile outposts clinging to survival. They were vibrant, growing societies with their own identities, their own grievances, their own ambitions. The question was no longer whether they could endure. The question was what they would become. By the late 1760s and early 1770s, the colonies were no longer quietly grumbling outposts. They had become restless, uneasy, and increasingly bold in their opposition to the British Crown. Life for most colonists still carried the same rhythm. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their fields. Shopkeepers opened their stalls. Children memorized their lessons in small schoolhouses. But the conversations that filled taverns, meeting houses, and town squares carried a sharper edge now. Where once loyalty to the king had been taken for granted, now suspicion and anger were beginning to take root. The British government, convinced that order could only be maintained through firmness, continued to impose laws that inflamed rather than soothed colonial discontent. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea, goods that flowed into households daily. Colonists responded with boycotts, refusing to buy imported British goods. In homes across the colonies, women spun their own cloth rather than purchase British textiles, a quiet but powerful act of defiance. Merchants who continued to sell British wares found themselves shunned, their reputations tarnished by neighbors who saw them as traitors to the colonial cause. As resistance grew, Britain dispatched soldiers to enforce its laws. Red-coated troops marched through the narrow streets of Boston, their presence a constant reminder of imperial authority. For many Bostonians, this occupation felt like an insult, an occupying army stationed in what was supposed to be a loyal city. The tension between townspeople and soldiers simmered daily, flaring in arguments, scuffles, and insults exchanged in the streets. It was in this heated atmosphere that the incident now remembered as the Boston Massacre unfolded. On a cold March evening in 1770, a crowd of colonists gathered outside the Custom House, taunting a small group of British soldiers. Snowballs and rocks were thrown. Voices shouted insults. Confusion filled the night, and then gunfire. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent. To the British, it was a tragic accident, a moment of panic. To the colonists, it was blood spilled by an occupying army against unarmed civilians. Word spread quickly, carried by pamphlets, newspapers, and sermons. The event was immortalized in engravings, etched into colonial memory as proof of British tyranny. Although some tensions eased temporarily after the repeal of certain duties, the larger conflict between Britain and the colonies was far from settled. The British Parliament, determined to assert its authority, kept the tax on tea as a symbol of its right to govern the colonies. At first glance, it was a small matter, a duty on a single commodity, but in reality it became the lightning rod for colonial anger. Tea was not simply a drink, it was a staple of daily life, consumed in nearly every household. To tax tea was to reach into the very heart of colonial kitchens and parlors. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the struggling East India Company the right to sell its surplus tea directly to the colonies at reduced prices, but still taxed. Britain believed this would appease the colonists. Cheaper tea, even with a small tax, seemed like a bargain. But colonists saw it differently. To accept the tea was to accept Parliament's right to tax them without representation. The principle mattered more than the price. In Boston, resistance took on a dramatic form. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded ships anchored in the harbor. Working swiftly and with deliberate purpose, they dumped 342 chests of tea into the cold waters below. The act, later known as the Boston Tea Party, was not simply vandalism. It was a bold declaration, a refusal to be governed without consent. The salt water mingled with the bitter leaves of tea. And as dawn rose the next day, the entire world seemed to know that Boston had openly defied the empire. The British response was swift and severe. Outraged by what they saw as an unforgivable act of rebellion, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts in 1774, which colonists soon called the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for, restricted town meetings, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than in the colonies. Most galling of all, the Quartering Act forced colonists to house and feed British soldiers. What had once felt like occupation now became domination. For the people of Massachusetts, these laws were crushing. Merchants lost their livelihoods as ships could no longer enter or leave the harbor. Families struggled under the weight of soldiers billeted in their homes. Anger spread like fire, not only in Boston but throughout the colonies. Even those far removed from Massachusetts recognized that if Parliament could impose such punishments on one colony, none of them were safe. In the face of these measures, the colonies drew closer together. Where once they had been divided by region, religion, and economy, now they began to see themselves as part of a shared struggle. In September 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia at what became known as the First Continental Congress. It was a gathering unprecedented in colonial history. Men from different regions, with different interests, sat together to deliberate. They did not yet speak openly of independence, but they spoke forcefully of rights, of liberties, of resistance. They drafted petitions to the king, organized boycotts, and prepared for the possibility of greater conflict. Back in the towns and villages, ordinary people braced themselves for what was to come. Blacksmiths forged weapons, farmers drilled with muskets in open fields, and local militias, calling themselves Minutemen for their readiness to act at a moment's notice, began to prepare. Sermons rang with calls to defend liberty, and broadsides urged unity. Though daily life continued, children played, crops were planted, shops opened. The air felt charged, as if everyone sensed that the old order was unraveling. Yet even in this tense atmosphere, there was still uncertainty. Many colonists remained loyal to Britain, convinced that the empire was their protector and that rebellion would bring only ruin. Others hesitated, unsure if they were truly ready to sever ties with the land of their ancestors. The divisions ran deep, within towns, within families, sometimes even within households. It was not yet clear which path would prevail, but the sense that something monumental was approaching could not be denied. The closing months of 1774 and the early months of 1775 felt like the last calm before a storm. From London's perspective, the colonies were unruly children, in need of discipline. From the colonies' perspective, they were men and women asserting rights that no parent could deny. Each side watched the other with suspicion, each step drawing them closer to confrontation. The story of America was no longer quiet, no longer ordinary. It had become a story of protests, boycotts, defiance, and blood spilled in the streets. The Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, the intolerable acts. These were not isolated incidents, but threads weaving into a larger fabric of resistance. The colonies had begun as scattered outposts clinging to survival. They had grown into communities that demanded recognition. Now, they were on the verge of becoming something more. A united people ready to risk everything for the idea of liberty. The world did not yet know it, but the first shots of revolution were only months away. The revolution was won, but the war's end was only the beginning of an even more complex chapter in America's story. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially recognizing the United States as an independent nation. It was a moment that many had fought and died for, a victory that had seemed improbable when the first musket was fired at Lexington. Yet, victory brought with it new questions. How does one build a nation from scratch? How does one govern a people who had just fought so hard to escape distant authority? At first, the country stumbled forward under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles had been written in haste during the war, when unity seemed more important than practicality. They created a system in which the states retained most of the power, while the central government had very little authority. Congress could not levy taxes directly, could not regulate trade effectively, and often struggled even to raise an army. Each state jealously guarded its independence, and mistrust between them simmered below the surface. In the countryside, ordinary citizens were already feeling the strain of a weak and disorganized government. Soldiers who had fought for independence often returned home to find themselves in debt, their farms threatened by foreclosure, and their sacrifices seemingly forgotten. The very liberty they had fought to secure now seemed precarious. In Massachusetts, this discontent boiled over into what would later be known as Shays' Rebellion. Led by a former Revolutionary War captain, Daniel Shays, farmers took up arms against the state government in 1786, demanding relief from crushing debts and unfair taxation. Though the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it exposed the fragility of the new republic and the dangers of leaving too much power in the hands of the states without a strong central government to bind them together. It became increasingly clear that the Articles of Confederation were failing. So, in 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia for what was initially meant to be a meeting to revise the Articles. What unfolded instead was the creation of an entirely new framework of government, the United States Constitution. The debates inside Independence Hall were long, heated, and often bitter. Some delegates feared that too strong a central government would undo everything they had fought for. Others argued that without a stronger system, the young republic would collapse under its own weight, or fall prey to foreign powers eager to exploit its weakness. Out of this tension came compromise, the Great Compromise, which created a two-house legislature with representation by population in the House of Representatives and equal representation for each state in the Senate. Another compromise, far more troubling, was the 3/5 compromise. which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. A haunting reminder that even as the nation proclaimed liberty, it was already entangled with the injustice of slavery. In 1789, the Constitution was ratified, and George Washington was elected as the nation's first president. Washington carried himself with dignity and restraint, fully aware that every decision he made would set a precedent for those who came after him. There were no rule books for the presidency, no examples to follow, only the hopes of millions and the weight of history. Washington chose a cabinet of trusted advisors, including Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Their clashing visions of what America should be, Hamilton's strong central government and emphasis on industry versus Jefferson's agrarian ideal and devotion to states' rights, would form the foundation of the first political parties. Meanwhile, the new government faced urgent tasks. The nation's finances were in chaos, with enormous war debts looming over them. Hamilton proposed a bold plan. The federal government would assume the debts of the states, establish a national bank, and encourage commerce and industry. To some, this looked like the very kind of centralized authority they had fought against. To others, it was a necessary step to stabilize the republic and prove to the world that America was here to stay. But even as the government was finding its footing, unrest simmered among the people. In 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion erupted in western Pennsylvania, where small farmers protested a federal tax on whiskey. Many of these farmers distilled their grain into whiskey as a way to earn money, and they saw the tax as unfair and burdensome. For Washington, this was a critical test. He personally led troops to suppress the rebellion, making it clear that the federal government had both the authority and the will to enforce its laws. Unlike Shays' Rebellion, which had revealed weakness, the Whiskey Rebellion showed strength. Foreign policy, too, became a constant balancing act. France, inspired by America's Revolution, had begun its own. The French Revolution soon spiraled into violence, and the United States found itself torn between loyalty to its old ally and the need to remain neutral. Britain, meanwhile, had never fully abandoned its ambitions in the Americas, harassing American ships and supporting native resistance in the Northwest Territory. Washington's policy of neutrality frustrated some, but it was rooted in the reality that the fragile new nation could not afford to be drawn into foreign wars. As the 1790s unfolded, the rift between Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans deepened. Newspapers filled with accusations and slander, each side convinced the other was leading the nation to ruin. Yet, through it all, the machinery of government continued to function, setting precedents that would endure long after the individuals were gone. When Washington decided not to seek a third term, it shocked many. Kings ruled until death, but Washington believed that stepping down was just as important as leading. His farewell address warned against political parties and entangling foreign alliances, advice that future generations would struggle to follow. In 1797, John Adams became the second president, the first time power had peacefully passed from one leader to another. It was a small miracle, but it demonstrated that the American experiment in self-government might just work. Yet, even as the nation's leaders debated in halls of power, the reality on the ground remained harsh for many. Native peoples continued to be pushed from their lands as settlers expanded westward. Enslaved men and women endured lives of unimaginable hardship, their forced labor underpinning the prosperity of the new republic. Women, too, remained largely excluded from political life, though their contributions during the Revolution and in sustaining communities were undeniable. The rhetoric of liberty and equality had ignited hopes, but those hopes remained unevenly distributed. By the dawn of the 19th century, the United States was a fragile union of contradictions, a beacon of freedom built on unfree labor, a democracy limited to a select portion of its people, a land of opportunity where survival was still uncertain for many. And yet, the spirit of possibility endured. The Revolution had secured independence, the Constitution had created a framework for governance, and the first leaders had set the course. The question that loomed was whether this fledgling nation could survive the storms to come, both from within and from beyond its borders. The story of America was still only beginning, and though its future was uncertain, the seeds of greatness and of conflict had already been planted deep in its soil. The new century dawned with America standing on the edge of both promise and peril. The Revolution was no longer a memory, but a foundation. The Constitution was no longer an experiment, but a functioning framework. Yet the early 1800s revealed how fragile this republic remained, and how expansion, ambition, and division would continue to shape its destiny. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States. His election was often called the Revolution of 1800, not because of bloodshed, but because it marked the first peaceful transfer of power from one political faction to another. For many observers around the world, this was extraordinary. Nations were accustomed to rulers who clung to power, to revolutions that devoured themselves. But here, in this fledgling republic, ballots replaced bullets. It was a quiet revolution, but perhaps the most profound one of all. Jefferson carried with him a vision of America as a nation of independent farmers, tied to the land and free from the corrupting influences of monarchy and aristocracy. He believed in limited government and the virtues of simplicity. Yet, his presidency would soon be defined by a decision that seemed anything but small or simple: the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, Jefferson seized upon an opportunity that would forever change the map of America. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, controlled the Louisiana Territory, a vast and largely unexplored stretch of land west of the Mississippi River. Napoleon, facing financial troubles and growing conflicts in Europe, agreed to sell the entire territory to the United States for $15 million. With the stroke of a pen, the nation doubled in size. It was the largest land acquisition in American history, and it revealed both Jefferson's pragmatism and his contradictions. He had long questioned whether the federal government had the authority to acquire such land, yet he justified it as an extraordinary necessity for the Republic's survival. This vast new territory was a place of wonder and mystery for most Americans, and Jefferson wasted no time in seeking to unlock its secrets. He commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead an expedition across the uncharted lands, hoping to find a route to the Pacific and to catalog the plants, animals, and peoples of the West. The Lewis and Clark expedition, beginning in 1804, became a journey of both scientific discovery and cultural encounter. Guided by Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman, they navigated rivers, mountains, and endless plains, encountering dozens of native tribes whose lives had long flourished in these lands. Their reports, once brought back to Jefferson, painted a portrait of a continent rich with possibility and challenge. Yet this new era of expansion carried shadows. For the native nations who lived across the continent, the Louisiana Purchase was not a promise, but a threat. Their lands were spoken of as if they belonged to distant leaders in Paris or Washington, their sovereignty ignored, their futures uncertain. Westward expansion would become both the dream and the curse of America, a promise of opportunity for settlers and a looming disaster for indigenous peoples. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States found itself entangled in the struggles of Europe once again. Britain and France, locked in a desperate conflict, each sought to control the seas. American ships, eager to trade with both sides, were caught in the middle. British ships often stopped American vessels, seizing goods and impressing sailors, forcing them into service for the British Navy. This practice of impressment outraged Americans and tested Jefferson's commitment to peace. Jefferson responded with the Embargo Act of 1807, halting all American trade with foreign nations. His intention was to protect American honor and avoid war. But the result was economic hardship. Farmers, merchants, and sailors all felt the sting of lost commerce, and many grew disillusioned with the policy. Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic clashed with the realities of an interconnected world economy. By the time Jefferson left office, the nation was both larger and more troubled than when he had taken charge. His successor, James Madison, inherited a nation moving inevitably toward conflict. Tensions with Britain escalated, fueled by impressment, trade restrictions, and British support for native resistance in the Northwest Territory. In 1812, war was declared. The War of 1812 was often called the Second War of Independence, a struggle to assert America's rights against the power of Britain. But unlike the Revolution, this war was fought with a divided public. Some saw it as essential for honor and sovereignty, while others, particularly in New England, viewed it as unnecessary and ruinous. The war was marked by both humiliations and unexpected triumphs. In the early years, American forces struggled against the well-trained British. Washington, D.C. itself was invaded in 1814, and the Capitol and White House were set aflame. The sight of the young nation's Capitol burning was a devastating blow to morale, a reminder of how precarious independence still was. Yet, from the ashes of defeat came moments of resilience. In Baltimore Harbor, as British ships bombarded Fort McHenry, a young lawyer named Francis Scott Key witnessed the American flag still flying at dawn. His poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, captured a spirit of endurance and defiance that would resonate long after the war ended. The most famous battle of the war came after peace had technically been secured. In January 1815, Andrew Jackson led a diverse force of soldiers, free African Americans, native allies, and even pirates in a stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans. The triumph electrified the nation and turned Jackson into a hero, even though the Treaty of Ghent had already ended the war weeks earlier. The War of 1812 left the United States with no clear victory in terms of territory, but it changed the way Americans saw themselves. They had stood against the world's greatest empire for a second time and survived. National pride surged, and the years that followed came to be known as the Era of Good Feelings. Under President James Monroe, the nation seemed more united than ever. The Federalist Party, weakened by opposition to the war, faded into irrelevance, leaving the Democratic Republicans dominant. Monroe's presidency was marked by optimism and expansion. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise attempted to balance the growing tension between free and slave states, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state while drawing a line across the Louisiana territory to determine the future of slavery in the West. It was a temporary solution to a problem that would continue to haunt the nation. Monroe also articulated what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, a bold declaration that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open to European colonization, and that any interference by European powers would be considered a threat to American security. Though the United States was still relatively weak compared to Europe, the doctrine reflected growing confidence and ambition. America was no longer simply surviving, it was beginning to assert its place in the world. But beneath the surface of national pride and territorial growth, contradictions deepened. Slavery was expanding, not shrinking, even as ideals of liberty were celebrated. Native peoples were pushed further from their homelands, their resistance increasingly crushed by military force. Immigrants arrived seeking opportunity, yet they often found suspicion and hardship. By the 1820s, a new generation of Americans had been born into a republic that had survived its infancy and was now struggling with adolescence. The Revolution was distant memory, the Constitution an established reality. But the questions of who truly belonged, who truly benefited from liberty, and what kind of nation America was destined to become, those questions remained unresolved. The United States had doubled in size, survived another war, and begun to dream beyond its borders. Yet with every new step forward, it also carried the weight of unresolved conflicts, contradictions, and compromises. The stage was set for even greater expansion and even greater struggles in the decades to come. The 1820s marked a turning point in the story of the United States. By now, the Revolution was a distant memory for most living Americans. A new generation had come of age, one that had not fought against the British Crown, but had instead been born into the promise of independence. These were the children of the era of good feelings, raised on stories of liberty and the vast possibilities of the continent. Yet as the nation grew larger, so too did its internal contradictions. Expansion was both a dream and a danger, and the choices made during these decades would shape America's identity in profound ways. One of the most defining figures of this era was Andrew Jackson, a man whose rise to power reflected the shifting character of American democracy. Jackson was not born into wealth or privilege like many of the early founding fathers. Instead, he was a self-made man, a war hero of the War of 1812, and a symbol of the rugged frontier spirit. His victory at the Battle of New Orleans had made him a national legend, and his rough, uncompromising personality appealed to many ordinary citizens who felt left behind by the political elite. The election of 1828 brought Jackson to the presidency, and with it came what was often called the Age of the Common Man. For the first time, politics seemed to belong not only to wealthy landowners, but to a broader portion of white male citizens. Property requirements for voting were being lifted across many states, and voter participation surged. Jackson's supporters portrayed him as the champion of the people, a man who would defend the republic against corruption and entrenched privilege. Yet Jackson's vision of democracy was far from universal. His policies and beliefs largely excluded women, Native Americans, and African Americans. For white men without property, this was a time of newfound political empowerment. For others, it was a period of growing exclusion and dispossession. Jackson's presidency was marked by fierce battles, both literal and political. He distrusted concentrated power, particularly in the form of financial institutions. His most famous fight was against the Bank of the United States, which he viewed as a corrupt institution that favored the wealthy elite at the expense of ordinary Americans. In 1832, when Congress attempted to renew the bank's charter, Jackson vetoed it, declaring that the bank was a monster threatening liberty. His decision unleashed what became known as the Bank War, a struggle over who would control the nation's economic future. Jackson's victory destroyed the bank, but it also destabilized the financial system, setting the stage for future crises. Another defining feature of Jackson's era was the push for westward expansion. By the 1830s, the United States was pressing deeper into territories long inhabited by native peoples. Settlers, hungry for land, saw the fertile soils of the Southeast as an opportunity for prosperity. But those lands were home to powerful native nations, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, often referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. These nations had adopted many aspects of European American culture, including farming practices, written languages, and even their own constitutions. Many believed that by adopting these ways, they could secure their place alongside the United States. But expansionist pressures were relentless. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, strongly supported by Jackson. This law authorized the forced relocation of native peoples from their ancestral homelands to lands west of the Mississippi, in what came to be known as Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. The consequences were devastating. The Cherokee, in particular, resisted removal, taking their case to the Supreme Court in the landmark decision Worcester versus Georgia. The court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, declaring that Georgia had no authority to enforce laws on Cherokee lands. But Jackson, defiant, is often remembered for responding with contempt, reportedly saying, John Marshall has made his decision. Now, let him enforce it. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, Jackson's actions made his stance clear. He would not protect native rights against state or settler demands. The forced marches that followed became known as the Trail of Tears. Tens of thousands of native men, women, and children were driven from their homes, often with little time to prepare. They walked hundreds of miles under harsh conditions, suffering from disease, hunger, and exposure. Thousands died along the way. For those who survived, the promise of a secure homeland in the West proved hollow, as American expansion would soon reach even those territories. The removal of native peoples was one of the darkest chapters of Jackson's presidency. But at the time, many white Americans saw it as inevitable, even necessary, for national progress. The tragedy highlighted the brutal costs of expansion and the profound injustice at the heart of American growth. While native peoples were being displaced, another group of Americans began to find their voices in new ways. The 1830s and 1840s saw the rise of reform movements that challenged the nation's conscience. Among them, the abolitionist movement began to grow louder, calling for the end of slavery. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator, demanded immediate emancipation, while former enslaved individuals like Frederick Douglass shared their powerful testimonies, exposing the cruelty of bondage to wider audiences. Women, too, began to press for greater equality. Though excluded from political power, they became central in reform movements, fighting for temperance, education, and eventually their own rights. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention would issue the Declaration of Sentiments, declaring that all men and women are created equal. This was still years away, but the seeds were being planted during the Jacksonian era. Religion also surged during this period in what was called the Second Great Awakening, a wave of religious revivals that swept across the nation. Preachers emphasized personal salvation, equality before God, and moral reform. These revivals gave energy to movements against slavery, alcohol, and social injustice, and they inspired countless Americans to see their nation as not only a political experiment, but also a moral mission. Meanwhile, the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined by Providence to expand across the continent, began to take hold. Newspapers, politicians, and ordinary settlers embraced this vision of inevitable westward growth. To many, it was a story of progress, opportunity, and national greatness. To others, particularly Native peoples and enslaved African Americans, it was a story of displacement, oppression, and struggle. By the 1840s, the United States was pushing ever closer to the Pacific. Texas, once part of Mexico, had declared independence in 1836 and sought annexation by the United States. The move was controversial, as it threatened to upset the delicate balance between free and slave states. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories loomed larger with every mile of land gained. The Jacksonian era, then, was one of paradox. It expanded democracy for some while denying it to others. It celebrated the voice of the common man while silencing native nations. It championed liberty while sustaining slavery. And it unleashed reforms that began to challenge those contradictions, planting the seeds of future conflict. By the mid-19th century, America was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a vast, growing nation, restless with ambition and pulled in many directions at once. The land stretched wider, the population grew faster, and the divisions deepened more dangerously. The age of Jackson had given voice to millions who had once been excluded from politics, but it had also set the stage for struggles that would test the very soul of the republic. The nation was on the move, westward, outward, forward, but the unresolved questions of who truly belonged, who truly had rights, and what freedom really meant were only becoming sharper. The story of expansion was also the story of exclusion, and the battles over those contradictions would define the decades to come. The 1840s brought with them an energy unlike any the United States had experienced before. The nation was in motion, its population growing rapidly, its borders stretching further west, and its ambitions soaring higher. But with this energy came friction, and with every new opportunity, new conflicts emerged. These years would see the nation expand to the Pacific Ocean, but they would also expose the fractures within its foundation, particularly the ever-growing divide over slavery. By the early 1840s, the idea of manifest destiny had fully taken root. This belief, that it was America's divine mission to expand across the continent, was repeated in newspapers, sermons, and political speeches. Expansion was portrayed as both inevitable and righteous, a fulfillment of the nation's purpose. But while many embraced this vision, others saw in it danger, conquest, and injustice. One of the earliest tests of this ambition was the question of Texas. Originally part of Mexico, Texas had been settled by large numbers of American immigrants who brought with them their customs, languages, and, crucially, their enslaved laborers. Tensions with the Mexican government escalated, culminating in the Texas Revolution of 1836. The heroic defense of the Alamo became a legend, though the battle itself was a crushing defeat. Ultimately, Texas won its independence, declaring itself a republic. For nearly a decade, the United States hesitated to annex Texas. The question of slavery loomed large. Texas was a slave-holding republic, and its admission risked upsetting the delicate balance between free and slave states. But pressure from expansionists and the lure of new land proved irresistible. In 1845, Texas was annexed into the Union, an act that infuriated Mexico and set the stage for war. The Mexican-American War broke out in 1846, sparked by disputes over the border between Texas and Mexico. For the United States, the war was framed as both a defense of Texas and an opportunity for expansion. President James K. Polk, a strong believer in manifest destiny, pushed aggressively for war, seeing in it a chance to fulfill the dream of a continental nation. The war was controversial from the start. Supporters saw it as a just cause, a chance to spread American liberty and secure vital lands. Critics, however, denounced it as an unjust war of aggression, designed to expand the reach of slavery. Among the critics was a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, who questioned the war's justification, and a writer named Henry David Thoreau, who refused to pay his taxes in protest, later writing Civil Disobedience. On the battlefield, American forces advanced quickly, capturing New Mexico, California, and eventually Mexico City itself. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, ended the war and ceded vast new territories to the United States, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The victory doubled the size of the nation once again and brought America to the shores of the Pacific. But the triumph came with consequences. The question of slavery in these new territories became a storm that threatened to tear the Union apart. Would these lands be open to free labor, or would they extend the reach of slavery? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had offered temporary solutions, but the scale of the new territory made compromise increasingly difficult. Even as the war reshaped the map, another event transformed the nation's imagination: the discovery of gold in California. In 1848, James Marshall found flakes of gold at Sutter's Mill, and word spread like wildfire. By 1849, thousands of people, 49ers, flooded into California from across the United States and around the world. The California Gold Rush was one of the largest migrations in history, drawing people from China, Latin America, Europe, and beyond. The gold rush brought fortune to some, but hardship to many more. Mining camps were harsh, dangerous places, filled with disease, lawlessness, and exploitation. For native peoples in California, the influx was catastrophic. Violence, displacement, and disease decimated communities. reducing populations that had endured for centuries. The dream of wealth for some became the nightmare of survival for others. The rush also forced a new political question. California's population had grown so rapidly that it sought statehood by 1850. But would California enter as a free state or a slave state? The debate culminated in the Compromise of 1850, a sweeping set of measures meant to hold the Union together. California entered as a free state, but in return, the South gained a harsher fugitive slave law, requiring citizens in all states to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. This law inflamed Northern opposition to slavery, as ordinary citizens were now forced to participate in its enforcement. As the 1850s progressed, the divide only deepened. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, a concept known as popular sovereignty. The result was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into Kansas, and violent clashes erupted, earning the territory the name Bleeding Kansas. Newspapers carried shocking accounts of massacres and raids as neighbors turned on each other in a preview of the larger conflict to come. The violence in Kansas was mirrored by violence in Washington itself. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner, an outspoken critic of slavery, delivered a fiery speech condemning its supporters. Days later, he was brutally beaten on the Senate floor by Representative Preston Brooks, a Southern congressman. The attack left Sumner gravely injured and symbolized the breakdown of civility in American politics. At the same time, new voices rose to challenge the nation's conscience. Abolitionists grew bolder, publishing newspapers, giving speeches, and organizing networks to help enslaved people escape through the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped enslaved woman, became a legendary conductor, leading dozens to freedom at immense personal risk. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin electrified the North, portraying the human suffering of slavery in ways that statistics and speeches never could. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies, igniting empathy and outrage across the nation, while Southerners condemned it as slander. The political landscape was also shifting. The old Whig Party collapsed under the weight of sectional division, and in its place, a new political force emerged: the Republican Party, founded on opposition to the expansion of slavery. This new party attracted diverse supporters: former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, abolitionists, and quickly grew in influence, setting the stage for new battles at the ballot box. By the late 1850s, the Supreme Court entered the fray with its infamous decision in Dred Scott versus Sandford. In 1857, the court declared that African Americans, free or enslaved, could not be citizens of the United States, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. The decision shocked the North, emboldened the South, and made compromise seem increasingly impossible. Meanwhile, a little-known Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln debated Senator Stephen Douglas in a series of public confrontations that captivated the nation. Lincoln argued that the spread of slavery threatened the very foundation of liberty, while Douglas defended popular sovereignty. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, his eloquence and moral clarity propelled him into the national spotlight. The 1840s and 1850s had begun with visions of expansion and progress, but they ended with the nation deeply divided. Manifest destiny had been fulfilled in geography, but at the cost of unity. Every mile of new territory seemed to deepen the question of whether America could survive as a house divided between slavery and freedom. The dream of a continental republic had come true. The nightmare of disunion was now looming on the horizon. The year 1860 had arrived, and the United States was standing at the edge of a precipice. The nation, which had survived revolution, expansion, and decades of political compromise, now faced a conflict that threatened to tear it apart entirely. The issue at the heart of this conflict was slavery, a deeply entrenched system that underpinned the Southern economy, social structure, and political power. Decades of tension, compromise, and intermittent violence had brought the nation to a breaking point, and the presidential election of 1860 would prove to be the catalyst for the crisis. The rise of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican nominee, was a man of modest beginnings. Born in a log cabin in Kentucky and largely self-educated, Lincoln had grown up in the frontier conditions of Indiana and Illinois. He had worked as a farm laborer, rail splitter, store clerk, and eventually as a lawyer. His rise to national prominence had been gradual but steady. In 1858, he faced Stephen Douglas in a series of debates for the U.S. Senate, known today as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln's arguments against the expansion of slavery, most famously encapsulated in his phrase, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," positioned him as a moral and intellectual force on the national stage. Though he lost the Senate race, he gained widespread recognition. Lincoln did not advocate immediate abolition of slavery where it already existed, but he insisted that it could not be allowed to spread into new territories and states. To the South, this position threatened the future of their economy, society, and political influence. They saw in Lincoln a direct challenge to the institution of slavery and a threat to their very way of life. The fractured election of 1860. The election of 1860 was a fragmented affair, with four main candidates. Abraham Lincoln, Republican, opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories. Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat, supported popular sovereignty, letting states decide for themselves. John C. Breckinridge, Southern Democrat, advocated federal protection of slavery in all territories. John Bell, Constitutional Union Party, sought to preserve the Union and avoid sectional conflict. Lincoln won a decisive victory in the Electoral College, even though he received only about 40% of the popular vote. He carried almost all the northern states while receiving 0 electoral votes from southern states. This outcome revealed a nation divided geographically, politically, and morally. The North and South now existed as two nearly separate nations in all but name. South Carolina secession. Just a month after Lincoln's victory, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860. The state argued that the federal government had failed to protect their rights, particularly the right to maintain slavery, and that secession was therefore necessary to preserve their sovereignty. South Carolina's departure set a precedent. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit, forming the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and cabinet member, was elected as its president. The Confederacy's creation was a profound challenge to the authority of the federal government, raising the question of whether the Union could survive at all. Lincoln's dilemma. When Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency in March 1861, the nation was already unraveling. In his inaugural address, he urged reconciliation. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." At the same time, he made it clear that he would not allow the Union to be permanently divided. He promised not to interfere with slavery in states where it already existed, but insisted that the federal government would preserve its authority and enforce the laws. Lincoln faced an almost impossible challenge: to maintain the Union without provoking immediate war, while also confronting a rebellion rooted in an institution many Northerners found morally abhorrent. Fort Sumter and the outbreak of war. Tensions reached a flashpoint at Fort Sumter, a federal installation in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Confederate leaders demanded the surrender of the fort, which was still manned by Union troops. When the Union commander refused, Confederate artillery opened fire on April 12, 1861. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours. Though no lives were lost during the shelling itself, the attack marked the official beginning of the Civil War. Fort Sumter became a symbol of the irreconcilable divisions within the country, and it rallied the North to defend the Union. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, prompting 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to secede and join the Confederacy. By mid-1861, the Confederacy consisted of 11 states, while the Union retained 25 loyal states. Mobilization and the home front. The war transformed the nation. Communities were reshaped as men left their homes to enlist in the armies. Families waited anxiously for news from the front lines, clinging to letters as lifelines. Northern states mobilized troops and resources, while southern states organized militias and fortified strategic positions. In both regions, newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches stoked patriotism, fear, and anger, creating a charged atmosphere that made compromise nearly impossible. The national mood. The Civil War was more than a military conflict. It was a moral and ideological struggle. Northerners fought to preserve the Union and eventually to challenge the expansion of slavery. Southerners fought to defend their way of life, rooted in slavery and agrarian dominance. The war tested loyalties, exposed deep-seated fears, and demanded extraordinary sacrifices. Even before the first major battles, the country began to understand the scale of what lay ahead. It would not be a brief conflict like many expected. Instead, it would be long, costly, and transformative, reshaping American society and the very meaning of freedom. The stage is set. As April 1861 closed, the United States stood on the brink. The conflict that began at Fort Sumter would soon spread across the nation, engulfing cities, farms, rivers, and plains. Both North and South were preparing for a struggle that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives and forever alter the trajectory of the country. The questions of liberty, equality, union, and human rights had moved from debate into the realm of action, and the answers would be written in blood, fire, and sacrifice. The Civil War had begun, and the United States would never be the same again. By the spring of 1861, the United States had fully entered a period of turmoil unlike anything it had faced before. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had shattered the fragile hopes for reconciliation, and now both the Union and the Confederacy were preparing for a long, brutal war. Cities across the North and South were alive with recruitment rallies, the clatter of training camps, and the anxious farewells of families sending sons, brothers, and husbands to fight. The war that many had predicted to be short and decisive was quickly revealing itself to be an epic struggle that would consume the nation. Mobilization and early strategies. The Union, under President Abraham Lincoln, faced the monumental task of organizing an army from scratch. Unlike the South, which could rely on local militias with a strong tradition of military service, the North needed to enlist volunteers, establish training facilities, and create supply chains on a national scale. The federal government moved quickly to call for 75,000 volunteers, expecting that the war would be over in months. They were wrong. The Confederacy, led by Jefferson Davis, faced its own challenges. The southern states were geographically vast, but less industrialized. They had fewer railroads, fewer factories, and fewer financial resources than the North. Yet, they had the advantage of fighting a defensive war on familiar territory. Southern generals, many of whom had graduated from West Point, were experienced and capable, and the morale of Confederate citizens was fueled by a belief in defending their homeland and way of life. Both sides devised strategies that reflected their strengths and limitations. The Union adopted what would become known as the Anaconda Plan, aiming to blockade southern ports, control the Mississippi River, and slowly squeeze the Confederacy into submission. The South, on the other hand, planned to defend its territory, protect its cities, and, when opportunities arose, strike at Union forces to erode Northern morale. The first major battles. The first significant confrontation came at First Bull Run, First Manassas, in July 1861, just outside Washington, D.C. Both armies were inexperienced, composed largely of volunteers with minimal training. Thousands of spectators, confident that the battle would be a quick Union victory, gathered on nearby hills to watch the fighting as if it were a spectacle. The battle began with intense skirmishes and confusion. Union forces advanced, but were met with stubborn resistance from Confederate troops. The tide shifted several times throughout the day, with neither side able to claim a decisive advantage. By afternoon, Confederate reinforcements under General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson turned the battle, forcing Union troops into a chaotic retreat. The Union soldiers fled back toward Washington, pursued by jubilant Confederate forces. The outcome shocked the nation. The war would not be short. Tens of thousands of men had been killed, wounded, or captured, and the illusion of a quick, heroic campaign was shattered. Civilians witnessed the reality of war, the chaos, the terror, and the staggering human cost. It was the first lesson that would haunt the North and South alike. This war would be long, bloody, and unforgiving. Leadership struggles. Both sides struggled with leadership during the early months of the war. The Union cycled through generals as they attempted to find someone capable of defeating Confederate forces. General George McClellan, a skilled organizer, took command of the Army of the Potomac. But his cautious approach frustrated Lincoln, who wanted more aggressive action. Other generals, such as Irvin McDowell and Ambrose Burnside, faced similar difficulties. Leadership in the Confederacy was also tested. Robert E. Lee, who would later become the Confederacy's most celebrated general, initially offered his services to the Union before ultimately siding with Virginia and the South, a decision rooted in loyalty to his home state. The lack of experienced leadership and the inexperience of the troops led to repeated tactical errors, miscommunications, and missed opportunities. The early campaigns revealed the complexity of coordinating large-scale armies in an era before rapid communication. Couriers, telegraphs, and visual signals were often unreliable, leaving commanders to make decisions with incomplete information. The human cost. Even as armies organized and battles were fought, the impact on ordinary people was immense. Soldiers faced disease, hunger, and exposure in addition to bullets and artillery. Camps were breeding grounds for illness, with dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox claiming more lives than combat in some cases. Families wrote letters full of fear, hope, and despair, often waiting weeks or months for a reply. Communities were fractured as men left farms and businesses, leaving women, children, and the elderly to manage households and local economies. Civilian populations in the South faced food shortages and inflation, particularly as the Union blockade began to strangle ports. In some towns, everyday goods became scarce, and the economy contracted sharply. In the North, industries shifted toward war production, fueling economic growth in some sectors, but creating labor shortages in others. The war was affecting every corner of society, not just the battlefield. The expansion of conflict. By the end of 1861, the war was spreading geographically. Skirmishes and battles occurred along the Eastern Theater, from Virginia to Maryland, while in the West, Union forces sought control of the Mississippi River and key strategic points in Kentucky and Tennessee. The Confederate strategy relied on interior lines, attempting to defend the heartland and strike opportunistically against advancing Union forces. The war was also beginning to affect international perceptions. European powers, particularly Britain and France, watched closely. Both nations had economic interests tied to Southern cotton, yet neither wanted to intervene decisively. The Union sought to prevent recognition of the Confederacy by European powers, understanding that international legitimacy could tip the balance in favor of the South. Early lessons and realizations. As 1862 approached, it became clear that the war would not be brief. Both sides had underestimated the scale of the conflict, the resilience of their opponents, and the technological and logistical challenges involved. Railroads, telegraphs, and mass-produced weapons had increased the potential lethality of combat, while the size of the armies meant that casualties would be unprecedented. Union leaders began to understand that victory would require not only superior numbers and resources, but also coordinated strategy, morale, and political support at home. The Confederacy, despite its initial advantages in morale and leadership, also recognized that sustaining a long war would be challenging given its smaller population and limited industrial capacity. The nation was entering a phase of total war, where every aspect of society, military, economic, social, and political, would be mobilized in the struggle. Civilians, soldiers, politicians, and generals alike would face decisions with life or death consequences, and the choices made in the early campaigns would have ramifications that reverberated throughout the conflict. The first battles, the leadership struggles and the mobilization of society, had taught a sobering lesson. This was not a conflict that would end in months. It would be a prolonged, bloody, and transformative war that would redefine the United States and leave an indelible mark on the world. By 1862, the United States was fully immersed in a conflict that was proving far bloodier and more complex than anyone had anticipated. The early skirmishes and battles of 1861 had taught both the Union and the Confederacy valuable lessons. War would not be swift, it would not be orderly, and it would exact a staggering human toll. The scale of the conflict was expanding in both geography and intensity, touching nearly every aspect of American life. The Eastern Theater, Virginia and Maryland. In the East, the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia were engaged in a series of bloody campaigns across Virginia and Maryland. Union General George McClellan, despite his organizational skills, was notoriously cautious, often delaying attacks and overestimating Confederate strength. This allowed Confederate General Robert E. Lee, newly appointed to command the Army of Northern Virginia, to seize the initiative. Lee was a master of maneuver warfare, understanding how to exploit both terrain and enemy indecision. In the 7 days battles of June and July 1862, Lee forced McClellan to retreat from the outskirts of Richmond, the Confederate capital, despite suffering significant casualties himself. These battles highlighted the growing ferocity of the war and the increasing sophistication of Confederate strategy. Lee then turned his attention northward, crossing the Potomac River into Maryland in September 1862. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17th near Sharpsburg, Maryland. This battle remains the single bloodiest day in American military history, with over 22,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Union forces, under McClellan, managed to halt Lee's advance, giving Abraham Lincoln the opportunity he had been waiting for to issue a decisive political statement. The Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, just days after the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be free. While the proclamation did not immediately liberate a single enslaved person, it fundamentally transformed the purpose of the war. No longer was the conflict solely about preserving the Union. It now included a moral imperative: the destruction of slavery. The proclamation also prevented European powers, particularly Britain and France, from recognizing the Confederacy, as public opinion in those countries was largely anti-slavery. For enslaved people themselves, the announcement was a beacon of hope, signaling that the Union was committed, at least symbolically, to their freedom. The Western Theater, Shiloh, and the Mississippi Valley. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater, the war was equally brutal. Union forces, under generals such as Ulysses S. Grant and Don Carlos Buell, focused on controlling the Mississippi River and key strategic points in Kentucky and Tennessee. The Battle of Shiloh, fought in April 1862 in southwestern Tennessee, revealed the shocking lethality of modern warfare. Confederate forces launched a surprise attack on Union troops, causing chaos and confusion. The battle lasted 2 days, with nearly 24,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Victory ultimately went to the Union, but at a staggering cost. The Western campaigns were critical in dividing the Confederacy and gaining control of vital rivers, which served as supply lines and strategic arteries. Each victory in the West brought the Union closer to fulfilling the Anaconda Plan, while each setback reminded both sides that the war's outcome was far from certain. Daily life and civilian suffering. As battles raged across the nation, the impact on civilians intensified. Families in the North and South were forced to cope with the absence of men, the devastation of local economies, and the terror of nearby battles. Refugees from war-torn areas fled to towns and cities, straining resources and creating humanitarian crises. Women, in particular, assumed new responsibilities, running farms, managing households, and sometimes even serving as nurses in makeshift hospitals. Medical care was rudimentary. Surgeons faced overwhelming numbers of wounded with limited supplies and knowledge. Amputations were common, often the only way to prevent gangrene from spreading. Disease was rampant. More soldiers died from illness than from combat in many campaigns. The war's reach extended beyond the battlefield, infecting every corner of American life with uncertainty, fear, and grief. African Americans and the war. The Emancipation Proclamation also opened the door for African Americans to actively participate in the war. Initially barred from enlistment in most units, black men soon formed their own regiments, fighting with courage and determination. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments, became famous for its assault on Fort Wagner in July 1863, demonstrating both valor and sacrifice. These troops faced discrimination, lower pay, and harsher conditions. Yet their contributions were indispensable to the Union cause. The war also fueled resistance and hope among enslaved people in the South. Many escaped to Union lines, providing critical intelligence and labor for the Northern armies. Plantations were disrupted, and the social order of the South began to unravel, as enslaved people seized opportunities to resist their bondage in whatever ways they could. Political tensions and leadership challenges. Lincoln faced intense pressure on all fronts. He had to manage a divided cabinet, the expectations of the public, the demands of generals, and the political machinations of Congress. His decisions were scrutinized daily, and critics on both sides questioned his leadership. Southern leaders, meanwhile, struggled to maintain unity within the Confederacy. States' rights advocates often clashed with the central government, creating internal tensions that complicated the Confederate war effort. The Union leadership began to learn that victory would require coordination, innovation, and relentless pressure. Generals like Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were starting to emerge as figures capable of executing bold strategies, emphasizing total war, mobility, and the disruption of Confederate infrastructure. Realization of war's scale. By the end of 1862, the scale of the conflict was undeniable. Tens of thousands of men had been killed or wounded, cities and towns were destabilized, and the human cost was mounting rapidly. Both North and South understood that the war would not be a brief campaign, but a prolonged struggle that would touch every aspect of life. The nation was transforming under the weight of conflict. Social structures, political norms, and even the concept of freedom were being redefined. The Union was fighting not only to survive, but also to redefine itself as a nation committed to liberty and equality, while the Confederacy clung desperately to its vision of independence and a social order built on slavery. As winter approached in 1862, both sides paused to regroup, rearm, and reconsider strategy. The coming year promised even larger battles, more suffering, and decisions that would forever alter the trajectory of the United States. The Civil War, now in its second year, was becoming a total war, a conflict in which every citizen, soldier, and resource was engaged in the struggle for the nation's future. By 1863, the United States was deep into the maelstrom of the Civil War. 2 years of fighting had already exacted a tremendous toll on the population, the economy, and the very fabric of society. Soldiers and civilians alike had begun to understand the immense scale and unprecedented brutality of this conflict. The early optimism of a short war had long since vanished, replaced by grim determination, desperation, and the realization that the nation's future was at stake. The turning tide in the East, in the Eastern Theater, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had emerged as a brilliant strategist, consistently challenging Union forces with audacious maneuvers. His victories at Second Bull Run in August 1862 had emboldened the South, while Union generals struggled to find a reliable leader capable of matching his brilliance. President Lincoln, frustrated with cautious commanders like George McClellan, searched tirelessly for generals who could deliver decisive victories while managing the complexities of logistics, morale, and politics. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 had been another devastating setback for the Union. Under the command of General Ambrose Burnside, Union forces launched repeated frontal assaults against well-fortified Confederate positions on Marye's Heights. The result was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Union soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, and the Army forced to retreat. The morale of Northern forces was shaken, and public confidence in military leadership wavered. Yet the war's narrative began to shift in 1863. Lincoln had used the Union's strategic pause to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which came into effect on January 1, 1863. While it did not immediately free all enslaved people, it fundamentally changed the nature of the war. The conflict was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now explicitly a war to end slavery in Confederate-held territories. The proclamation also discouraged European powers from intervening in support of the Confederacy, as public opinion in Britain and France was largely anti-slavery. The Western Theater and the Mississippi Campaign. The Western Theater saw equally dramatic developments. Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant had been steadily advancing in the Mississippi Valley, seeking to split the Confederacy and gain control of strategic rivers. The Battle of Vicksburg, fought over several weeks in 1863, was a masterclass in siege warfare. Grant's forces surrounded the Confederate stronghold, cutting off supplies and bombarding the city relentlessly. On July 4, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered, giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River. This victory was monumental, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and providing a vital supply line for the Union Army. It was also a psychological blow to the South, demonstrating that Union forces could conduct coordinated, large-scale operations successfully. Gettysburg, the war's turning point. Perhaps no battle was more symbolic than the Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to 3, 1863. Lee, emboldened by previous victories, invaded Pennsylvania, hoping to strike a decisive blow in Union territory and pressure Northern politicians into negotiating peace. The battle began with Confederate forces engaging Union troops in and around the small town of Gettysburg. Over 3 days, more than 160,000 soldiers clashed in intense combat. The fighting was relentless, with charges across open fields, artillery barrages, and hand-to-hand combat. On the third day, Lee launched the infamous Pickett's Charge, a frontal assault against fortified Union positions on Cemetery Ridge. The attack failed disastrously, with Confederate forces suffering massive casualties. Gettysburg marked a turning point in the war. Lee's retreat back to Virginia ended Confederate hopes of offensive dominance in the North, while Union forces gained a renewed sense of momentum. The battle also cemented the reputations of both sides' leaders. Lee as audacious but overextended, and Union generals like George Meade as capable of holding strategic ground under immense pressure. The home front, society under strain. By mid-1863, the war's effects on civilians were staggering. Families in both the North and South endured scarcity, inflation, and constant anxiety. Women took on expanded roles, managing farms, businesses, and households, while also contributing to war efforts as nurses, fundraisers, and organizers of relief supplies. Cities faced overcrowding as refugees fled battle zones, and hospitals struggled to treat the flood of wounded soldiers. In the South, the blockade imposed by the Union was creating acute shortages. Food, clothing, and medical supplies were increasingly difficult to obtain. Confederate soldiers faced malnutrition, worn uniforms, and inadequate medical care, yet their morale was sustained by the belief in defending their homeland. In the North, the economy was booming in some sectors, with factories producing weapons, ammunition, and supplies. But this came at a human cost. Labor shortages, strikes, and growing discontent among those who were directly or indirectly affected by the war. African American contributions and resistance. African Americans played an increasingly visible role in the conflict. Freedmen and escaped enslaved people provided critical labor for the Union Army, serving as guides, scouts, and logistical support. Black soldiers, organized into regiments such as the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, fought with extraordinary courage, challenging prejudice while demonstrating their determination for freedom and equality. Their actions were pivotal not only in military terms but also in shaping public perceptions of African American contributions to the nation's survival and moral future. Political, maneuvering, and leadership challenges. Lincoln's leadership was tested repeatedly. He faced criticism from both radical Republicans who wanted immediate abolition and conservative factions who prioritized reconciliation. He had to balance the demands of Congress, generals in the field, and a restless public, all while managing the broader strategic objectives of the Union war effort. Southern leaders, too, faced internal tensions as states' rights advocates resisted central control, complicating military coordination and resource allocation. The war had evolved from a series of battles into a total conflict affecting every aspect of society. Civilians were mobilized, economies were redirected toward the war effort, and the moral stakes of the conflict were clearer than ever. The Union's objective was no longer merely to preserve the nation. It was now a struggle for freedom, justice, and the very definition of what America would become. Preparing for the final push. By the end of 1863, the war had reached a critical juncture. The Union had achieved major victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, while the Confederacy's capacity for large-scale offensive operations had been significantly curtailed. Yet the fighting was far from over. The war would continue to rage across multiple theaters, with both sides suffering staggering losses and facing the harsh realities of modern, industrialized warfare. The stage was set for the final chapters of the conflict, where strategy, leadership, and the will of the people would converge to determine the fate of a nation divided. The coming years promised to bring more battles, greater suffering, and ultimately a reckoning that would reshape the United States forever. By 1864, the United States had endured nearly 4 years of relentless conflict. The Civil War, which began as a struggle to preserve the Union, had evolved into a monumental contest over the very principles on which the nation was founded. Blood had soaked fields from Virginia to Mississippi, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians had been irrevocably altered. The nation stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain, yet the determination of leaders and citizens alike was unwavering. Lincoln's leadership and re-election. President Abraham Lincoln faced immense pressure in 1864. The war, though turning in favor of the Union, had dragged on far longer than anyone had anticipated. Casualty reports filled newspapers daily, and public patience was wearing thin. Many questioned Lincoln's leadership, while political opponents speculated that he might lose the upcoming election. Despite these challenges, Lincoln remained steadfast. His vision for the Union was clear. The nation must endure, and slavery must be eradicated to secure its moral and political integrity. To strengthen his political position, he replaced his original vice president with Andrew Johnson, a Southern Unionist, demonstrating his commitment to preserving the Union while appealing to a broader constituency. Lincoln's campaign was also aided by military successes in the field. Victories under General Ulysses S. Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman boosted Northern morale and provided tangible evidence that the war could be won. Lincoln's steadfastness and moral clarity ultimately secured his re-election, giving him the mandate to continue prosecuting the war to its conclusion. Grant and the strategy of total war. General Ulysses S. Grant, appointed as commander of all Union armies in March 1864, implemented a strategy of relentless pressure against Confederate forces. Unlike his predecessors, Grant was willing to sustain high casualties in pursuit of victory, understanding that the Confederacy could not endure a protracted, total war against a numerically and industrially superior opponent. Grant's overland campaign in Virginia brought Union forces into constant contact with Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Battles at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor were characterized by brutal, continuous fighting, high casualties, and staggering determination on both sides. The fighting was often chaotic and unimaginably bloody, with soldiers facing entrenched positions, artillery barrages, and close-quarters combat. Yet Grant's strategy wore down Confederate forces, forcing Lee into a defensive posture and limiting his ability to threaten the Union capital. Sherman's March to the Sea. In the Western Theater, General William Tecumseh Sherman executed one of the most famous campaigns of the war. After capturing Atlanta in September 1864, Sherman embarked on his march to the sea, moving from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, with an army of 60,000 men. Sherman's objective was to destroy Confederate infrastructure, demoralize the Southern population, and cripple the South's ability to wage war. Sherman's forces burned railroads, confiscated crops, and destroyed factories and supply depots. His march created widespread disruption, forcing civilians to confront the harsh realities of a total war, where the line between combatants and non-combatants was increasingly blurred. Though controversial, the campaign was strategically decisive, demonstrating the Union's capacity to project power deep into the Confederacy and hastening the war's end. The final campaigns and collapse of the Confederacy. By early 1865, the Confederacy was on the brink of collapse. Grant's forces had trapped Lee's army in Petersburg, Virginia, after a prolonged siege that drained Southern resources and morale. The Union's superior numbers and logistical capacity ensured that Confederate forces could not hold out indefinitely. In April 1865, Union troops broke through Confederate lines at Petersburg, forcing Lee to retreat toward Appomattox courthouse. On April 9, 1865, Lee formally surrendered to Grant, marking the effective end of the Civil War. The surrender was conducted with dignity and respect, signaling a desire to begin the process of reconciliation. Confederate soldiers were paroled, allowed to return home with their personal possessions, and the nation began the painful work of healing. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction. With the war's conclusion, Abraham Lincoln turned his attention to Reconstruction and reunification. He envisioned a process of reconciliation that would restore the Southern states to the Union, while securing civil and political rights for freed slaves. His approach emphasized leniency, forgiveness, and the rebuilding of national unity, though he recognized the challenges ahead. Tragically, Lincoln would not live to see the fruits of his vision. On April 14, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The nation mourned the loss of its leader, whose guidance had been instrumental in preserving the Union and redefining freedom in America. Yet, his legacy endured, embodied in the ideals for which he had fought: liberty, equality, and a united nation. The human cost and legacy. The Civil War had exacted an unimaginable toll. Over 600,000 soldiers had died, with countless others wounded or permanently scarred. Civilian populations had endured displacement, famine, and violence. Entire regions, particularly in the South, were left in ruins. Economies had been devastated, and social hierarchies overturned. Yet the war also marked a turning point. Slavery was abolished, legally and permanently, with the passage of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. The Union was preserved, and the United States emerged as a nation fundamentally transformed. The ideals for which people had fought, freedom, equality, and the right to self-determination, became central to the nation's identity, even as the struggle for full realization of these ideals would continue for generations. Reflections on the war. The Civil War was not merely a military conflict, it was a profound reckoning with the nation's values, priorities, and identity. It revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the United States, tested the limits of human endurance, and reshaped every aspect of society. Leaders, soldiers, and civilians alike were forced to confront moral, political, and practical dilemmas on a scale unprecedented in American history. As the smoke cleared and the soldiers returned home, the country faced the long task of reconstruction, reconciliation, and remembrance. Communities worked to rebuild, honor the fallen, and integrate newly freed African Americans into society. The lessons of the Civil War, about the costs of division, the importance of leadership, and the resilience of the human spirit, would echo across generations. By the end of 1865, the United States, though battered and grieving, stood united once more. The war had preserved the Union, ended the institution of slavery, and set the stage for a nation striving toward justice, equality, and enduring liberty. The story of the Civil War was a testament to the trials, sacrifices, and perseverance of an entire nation, and its legacy would continue to shape the identity of the United States for centuries to come.